for a discussion based on a book by my old friend, in both senses of the word, James Cullingham. His book is called Two Dead White Men. It's based on his doctoral dissertation. The subtitle is Duncan Campbell Scott, Jacques Soustelle, and the Failure of Indigenous Policy. Nancy Janovicek, professor of history from University of Calgary, is going to interview James about his book and the ravages of colonialism generally, I believe. So is that all I had to say right now? Okay, so James Cullingham is an adjunct professor of Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies at Trent University. He is also a part-time professor at Seneca College. So please welcome Nancy and James to the front.
So, thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to see you, and thank you, Nancy, for agreeing to do this. Thanks, June. Thanks, Joanne, and Shelf Life Books, and Calgary generally. Joanne and I met when we were 17 in Switzerland, so that's a while ago. A bit about the book, just to set up. We're going to do a short reading, but the book is a real throw from my dissertation. It's a much more visual and journalistic treatment of what was a dissertation in history. And I want to thank Seneca College, which published it, where I taught for 20 years and continue to teach. Michael Maynard, who was the Dean of the Faculty of Communication, Art and Design at Seneca, who designed the book. And all the folks that I studied with doing my PhD at York University, the students that I taught at Seneca, and the long association I've had with what, when I was a student, was Native Studies at Trent, is now the Cheney Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies. And I've been very, very fortunate, forgive me, very fortunate to have an association with Trent and with Indigenous Studies at Trent for over 30 years. So I'm going to start right at the beginning and then zip to the end, because when you're an author, apparently you get to cannibalize your work. So in the summer of 1992, I was camped with my family near Horseshoe Bay in Puckasaw National Park on the north shore of Lake Superior. At the suggestion of my friend and colleague, the anthropologist, author, and filmmaker, Hugh Brody, I took a collection of Duncan Campbell Scott's poems along. In the evenings, when the wind calmed down on that great inland sea, I paddled out to the mouth of the Pic River near the Ojibways of the Pic River First Nation and read. Drifting in the prolonged Lake Superior sunset, I discovered that Scott's poetry was more intriguing and perplexing than I had presumed. I had first encountered Scott as an undergraduate student in what was then the Native Studies Department, now the Cheney Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies at Trent University in Nogajeewanong, Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. Cheney Wenjack was an Anishinaabe child who died trying to walk home from a residential school in Northern Ontario. At the time, Scott was regarded in the academic and activist circles I kept strictly as the notorious early 20th century bureaucratic mastermind of Canadian Indian policy. Little thought had been given by me or my academic and activist peers to Scott's artistic pursuits. Paddling in the same waters Scott had visited on a treaty expedition in 1906, I began to realize that his story was far more complex than I had imagined. How did this accomplished artist come to participate in some of Canada's most egregious assaults on human rights? My wrestling with that question led to my 1995 documentary film, Duncan Campbell Scott, The Poet and the Indians. With control over its own Indian policies, a post-Confederation Canada internalized and hardened British imperial systems. Duncan Campbell Scott was as influential as any single person in honing and implementing those policies in the critical post-Confederation era. This work is also a product of a lifetime's interest in France. When I began working on Jacques Soustelle in 1905 on a paper about French intellectuals in Algeria, my then supervisor urged me to discover Soustelle. He said, Bill Irvin was his name, "Aren't you the guy who made a film about D.C. Scott? You should look into Jacques Soustelle. You find him interesting." In his tumultuous career, Jacques Soustelle, although trained as an ethnologist, was also an active politician. Most infamously, Soustelle was the last French Governor General of Algeria. He got that post in 1955 because of his familiarity with indigenous societies. Such knowledge was considered valuable in France's last-ditch effort to reform its relationships with the majority indigenous population of Algeria. Soustelle was haunted and inspired by Mexico, a land of ancient civilizations and the site of the Western world's first great 20th century revolution. Soustelle believed he could import to Algeria what he had garnered from a particular aspect of post-revolutionary Mexico as a graduate student in the 1930s. His thinking was shaped by the cultural, economic, political, and social program known as Indigenismo, a sweeping and often contradictory set of policies set to aim to incorporate the Indian in Mexican society. Soustelle attempted to apply what he deemed valuable from Indigenismo to relations between Europeans and Muslims in Algeria to salvage France's imperial project in the Maghreb, Northern Africa. The last chapter was not in the dissertation at all. In fact, my supervisor said, save it for the book, where I tried to, that was Caroline Petrucci. I mean, I've been a journalist, I've been a documentary filmmaker, I've been a radio producer at CBC, and I've taught journalism, history, and documentary film. The reader can judge for herself, but what I've tried to do in the book, and certainly in the last chapter, is bring those various tools together. And so chapter 5 is called, the final chapter 6 is called Past is Present. I'll read a short bit from the ending. On June 11, 2008, a crowd gathered outside the House of Commons in Ottawa. A giant video screen on a flatbed trailer hitched to a pickup truck was in position for an overflow crowd of curious onlookers that gathered, waiting to hear Prime Minister Stephen Harper speak to Parliament. Inside Parliament, Indigenous elders, some accompanied by their grandchildren, filed into an upper lobby that leads to the public gallery overlooking the House floor. Harper was about to apologize to the Indigenous people of Canada on behalf of all Canadians for the abuses and injustices of the residential school system. In the gallery where I stood, Indigenous elders, their children and grandchildren, looked down upon the Prime Minister. An elderly woman stood and looked directly at Harper while clutching an eagle feather in her fist. A young man in the same gallery section caressed a skin drum. On the floor of the House of Commons, members of Parliament and the leaders of Indigenous organizations turned their attention to the Prime Minister as he rose. I won't read the quote, but the Prime Minister apologized for one of the principal policies that Duncan Campbell Scott had implemented as a senior civil servant for the government of Canada. At dawn on the morning of that apology, Indigenous spiritual elders, Indigenous spiritual leaders, elders, residential school survivors, and their supporters gathered on Victoria Island in the Ottawa River below Parliament Hill for a sunrise ceremony. They sought serenity and national reconciliation. In Paris on June 18th, 2010, solemn commemorations marked the 70th anniversary of the 1940 appel that Charles de Gaulle transmitted from London letting les Français and the world know that he had decided to lead the resistance to the Nazi occupation of France. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a military attaché to the French ambassador responded to that appel. 28-year-old Jacques Soustelle soon sent word from the Mexican capital that he would serve de Gaulle. Soustelle joined Paul Rivet, Germaine Tillon, and others associated with the Musée de l'Homme in joining the resistance. In their biography of Pierre Trudeau, authors Stephen Clarkson and Christina McCall added a phrase to the lexicon of Canadian political history and journalism. Trudeau, they wrote, haunts us still. Clarkson and McCall argued that the highly atypical Canadian Trudeau, whose charisma, unapologetic intellectualism, and sex appeal set him apart from normal political life in Canada, haunted a Canadian public which could never pin him down or figure him out. Duncan Campbell Scott and Jacques Soustelle haunt me still. This work, which had its beginnings while floating in a canoe on Lake Superior near the waters off the mouth of the Pic River almost 30 years ago, has taken me on a wondrous journey of discovery. The overarching questions about these men linger and yes, haunt. How is it that Scott blithely or not so blithely could ignore or remain detached from what in the light of in the light of 21st century hindsight are the worst human rights crimes in Canadian history? Revelations regarding hundreds of unmarked graves of Indigenous children near the sites of former residential schools dominated Canadian media and tarnished Canada's image abroad throughout the spring and summer of 2021. The inescapable truth is that Scott embodies, in stark cultural and policy terms, the fundamental disconnect between Canadian liberalism and a positive, meaningful expression of Indigenous economic, political, and human rights in the settler state, Canada. Scott was not merely an individual, he was a manifestation of a bad system made by humans and changeable by humans. The hell of the matter is that Scott, in my view, accomplished some great artistic works. The best of his poems and short stories deserve their place in the pantheon of Canadian literature. What intellectual, or dare I say, neat ethical summation can be made of Jacques Soustelle? Soustelle plotted, but failed to kill his mentor, Charles de Gaulle. A contrarian to the end of his days, some of Soustelle's late life opinions about South Africa and the Middle East seem outlandish to many. French journalist and Soustelle biographer Bernard Ullmann labeled Soustelle le mal-aimé, the unloved one, or perhaps more accurately still, the black sheep. Soustelle's unruly presence hovers still both over the discipline of French ethnology and memories of the French-Algerian conflict. As a social scientist, the ringing clarity, profound curiosity, and bold genre-busting multidisciplinary ambitions of his best works about Mexico remain relevant. As a political iconoclast, his unpopular predictions and denunciations of theocratic Islamist excesses and his premature advocacy of a proto-federal cohabitation between a European metropole, such as France, and the decolonizing nations of Africa, such as Algeria, seem now at times to have the ring of prophecy. And that'll be it for the reading. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, James. This book was an interesting book to read. It was a pleasure to read, and it was nice to look over your shoulder to see how beautiful it is. On my, I printed it out, but like I get a better sense of how wonderful the work of your designer was. You kind of have taken away some of the stuff from my first questions. My first question was going to be to introduce them, but what else do you think we should know about Duncan Campbell Scott and Soustelle in terms of their backgrounds and who they were before they were these kind of well-known, as you put it, public intellectuals, politicians, and artists? Is there anything else you want to introduce about them?
Sure. Scott was the son of a minister. I think that's important. And his father had worked with Indigenous people in Manitoulin Island and in the vicinity of Ottawa. The family was not wealthy. Scott wanted to become a doctor. His parents couldn't afford the education, and his father introduced him to John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, and Macdonald hired Duncan Campbell Scott at age 17. So he worked at and it was called the Indian Department from 1876 until his retirement in 1947. So from age 17. So he was a person of Ottawa. He was befriended by great artists. Emily Carr liked him. Lauren Harris liked him. Archibald Lampman was his best friend. When he died, Saturday Night Magazine and others called him the unofficial poet laureate of Canada. So, like Soustelle, he represents the best and brightest of Canadian intellectualism and artistic expression at a certain period of time. We don't see him that way now, but it's very important to realize that's how he was seen during his lifetime. And Soustelle was Protestant, which is significant in France. He always was an outsider. He was literally one of the 5 smartest 17-year-olds in France, because they have these national exams, and Soustelle was of working class roots in Montpellier, Lyon, south of Paris, not near the capital, and he aced the entry exams and was put immediately at age 17 into the PhD stream at the École Nationale Supérieure. So, you know, extremely gifted person, very adventurous. You know, age 19, he goes and his wife go off into the jungle of Chiapas to do their PhD research and stuff. So a politician, a Gaullist, until he fell out with Shah over Algeria. And that's very important. People never knew what to make of Soustelle. Some people thought he was a Marxist.
Yeah.
Some people thought he was a fascist. Some people thought he was of the right. Other people in the French political world thought he was of le juste milieu. He knew where the center was. You know, in the last 10 years, there are 2 new biographies of him in France. So in French, so the French are still preoccupied with Soustelle.
Okay, I'm going to ask this now. I was going to ask it later, but at one point, like, there are different colonial. I liked how you're talking about him being le juste. Maybe I'm going to wreck my French Canadian partner's embarrassed by now, but like that common middle, right? Like he's either the right or left of the middle. But I mean, it feels like in different colonial contexts, he was different people, right? Because you've spoken about how progressive he was in his understanding of Mexico. But then at some point in the book, you talk about how he couldn't bring that empathy that he had for Indigenous peoples in Mexico to his governorship in Algeria, right? And
well, he thought he was. I mean,
yeah,
I guess it was like tough love. I mean, he, you know, through no fault of his own, he happened to be named Governor General 3 months after the revolt of the FLN, the Algerian Revolutionary Force, broke out. And he went with these ambitious reforms. He was immediately set out to make Arabic a language at the same level as French. He immediately petitioned Paris constantly to increase the representation of the Muslim and Berber majorities in the parliament. They did have some. So the context is very, very different. As you know, colonialism is actually very complex, and there are different forms of colonialism. And the French, certainly with Soustelle and a few others, Albert Camus would be one of them. We know about him. Germaine Tillon, the fabulous, brilliant ethnographer and colleague of Soustelle, who was a Marxist, and she joined Soustelle's cabinet in Algeria. So there were people who thought, we got a shot here. Well, they did.
Yeah.
You know, and Soustelle, I argue in the book, and others have argued elsewhere, he made the fateful decision, we can win the war, and then we can go ahead with the reform program.
Right.
Germaine Tillon and others said, no, we got to stop fighting the war and reform. That's a strategic blunder that he made.
I want to pick up on what you said about colonialism being very complex and how it plays out. There are patterns that play out over time that are similar, which is why comparative colonial histories are important to do, and why, as you argue in the book, we need to think about Canadian colonialism in a transnational context. But bringing these kinds of colonialism and two time periods together is unique and brave and bold and different. So my question then is, why? I mean, there's your interest in these two issues, but why did you and how did you bring these two very different colonial contexts together? Canada being settler colonial, Algeria being majority Indigenous, Berber, and that with the Pied Noir being a minority. So it's brave and bold. So can you talk through the thought process of bringing these two different colonial contexts in different periods together and why that's useful? It is useful, but I want to hear from your mouth.
I think it's because of Mexican indigenismo,
Okay.
and how that inspired Soustelle, and various Canadian and American and other European political figures, anthropologists, novelists, Graham Greene, D.H. Lawrence. A lot of people have thought about indigeneity in Mexico and what that means for the modern world and what it means for other countries that have indigenous populations. Soustelle, forgive me, Scott never got to that. But interestingly, his second wife, 30 years his junior, Elise Hélène, was fascinated with Mexico and New Mexico. So I thought that the bridge for me was France continues to have a relationship with these countries. France is bedeviled by the inadequate relationship it has with very sizable minority groups with roots from those countries in France itself. They are, in a sense, the urban indigenous people of 21st century France. And Canada, of course, has this huge crisis of what does reconciliation mean? What is truth? And how can we respectfully, as a settler state, or someone like myself as a public person, as an educator, deal respectively with the First Peoples? So I think those challenges are still there. But the thread for me was Mexico and its meaning, and the fascination that many people, including Soustelle, have had with it for a long time.
You talked about Scott then in your introduction, or in this excerpt that you read, being a product of liberalism, and you draw on Ian Mackay's very influential liberal order framework to discuss this in the book. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the Canadian tradition of liberalism, as you talk about it in the book, as being exclusionary, and then how that influenced and helped to inform Indigenous policy, and then how Indigenous peoples resisted that, and how that works in Duncan Scott's work.
Well, I think that liberalism as practiced in Canada, certainly, and elsewhere, always relies on exclusion. There are a set of norms that one has to achieve. And to begin with, it was to be a white Christian male who held property. That those were the people who were going to benefit from the liberal order to begin with in 1867. Now, Canada's changed a lot in that respect, but we spent most of our history struggling with, well, we didn't struggle with it so much. We called them wards, we called them children. People living in First Nation communities didn't get the vote until 1960, almost a century of taking their natural resources and developing the country. So I think that Scott's idea of liberalism and the prime ministers and the parliaments and the parliamentary committees and the journalistic community that were very well aware of the policies of the Indian Department accepted the notion that Indigenous people in Canada aren't ready to join the party. They may be at some point, but probably what they'll have to do, and this is residential schools and other things, probably what they're going to have to do is assimilate and be as much like us as possible. The idea of being a Canadian and Indigenous is very new in our politics. So in that sense, I would suggest that Canadian liberalism, as practiced by whether the Prime Minister was a member of a Liberal Party or a Conservative Party, and Scott served both, exclusion was part of the bedrock of the policies. Who do we let in? Who do we not let in? And there are some people who are looking at that, a lot of very qualified liberal political theorists, Jennifer Pitts would be one, who aren't looking at it in the Canadian context. So but certainly Ian Mackay is, and I tried to build on that work as best I could.
Yeah, and you do it. I like the way you bring his work in, and it also reminded me. I'd recently finally read an interesting piece by Henry Yu in a book called Dominion of Race, and it's entitled Provocation, but he's kind of pushing back on this "they were a man of their times" argument by building on what you said, saying, okay, but this democratic consensus that they weren't ready yet was very much built on the exclusions from voting and participation in education, et cetera, that you're talking about. And it made me, I really thought about that when you were talking about Duncan Campbell Scott and the debates about Bill 14. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about what Bill 14 was and his role in ensuring, right, that Indigenous voices weren't heard in that space.
Is that enfranchisement or mandatory?
Schooling.
Mandatory school.
I mean, they're kind of schooling here, yeah.
Well, I think I chose that particularly because whether it was banning land claim research or political organizations, you could look at any number of planks. I thought this is an instance where Scott very much got involved. He was the equivalent of the deputy minister.
Yeah.
It wasn't the minister who went and defended it in Parliament. It wasn't the minister who delivered the briefing papers, who talked to journalists, who sent countless telegrams to people running residential schools and stuff saying, you have to lobby my colleagues to make sure this happens. We have to insist that these children get into school and that their parents can only visit them on extremely limited basis, if at all, and that they get to go home during their education as little as possible because we're not assimilating enough Indians quickly enough. And that's certainly, if you're looking for this, the so-called smoking gun with Scott, it seemed to me that his aggression on that particular point, his determination. And that's the moment where, you hear the quote a lot, and he did say it during those deliberations. It's in the paper that he wrote to frame his argument, I don't want there to be any more Indians in the body politic of Canada. We have to complete this assimilation project. And he confidently predicted it could be done. Well, he said to Parliament 50 years, but then he wrote in an encyclopedia that it would take centuries to Britain in Canada and its provinces. So his thinking was a bit muddled, or maybe he had a political official face and then he was thinking something else. But so I think that his hostility to Indian parents who wanted control over their children's education, and I'm only using the word Indian because that was what was used at the time, and also with enfranchisement, aggressively seeing that anybody who moved to the city, who joined the army, who wanted to have a profession, also signed off their identity, joined the club at the expense of their identity. And he was, you know, he had his hands on the throttle on those policies.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask questions too. We'll talk about that later because I want to talk about stuff. So what you said, you know, that he thought that this would be, he publicly stated that this would happen in 50 years. And now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about your career and everything in your career that brought you to this book, because really one of the beautiful things about this book is it's a great revised dissertation, but it's more than a revised dissertation because you bring to this book all of those years of journalism, your work as a filmmaker, and your work as a social worker in Kenora, where I did a little bit of research, right? So I want to talk about the interludes as well. But I mean, I was watching, I couldn't get all through The Poet and the Indian because Vimeo kept shutting me down, and I'll get back to it later. But like Ovid Mercredi says in what I was able to watch, if you try to destroy a culture, we will fight harder, right? Mm-hmm. And so that I could see informing a lot of what was going on in your book, but also what you do in the past system, which I have watched and teach. But I want to talk about how all of these threads of your intellectual work come together to help you think through these things. And maybe you want to do it by discussing the interludes, because one of the things that happens in the book is there are these interludes where there's a page where it's just an excerpt from you're paddling someplace, or you're talking about being working with youth in Kenora and stating we should bring the elders in to speak to the students and being shut down. You can choose whichever interlude, but I found that very powerful to hear you and your history coming through this very important, like, academic research as well.
Well, I've been very fortunate, Nancy, to canoe a lot of beautiful rivers in the Canadian North. And I met along the way remarkable people on the Winnisk River and in the, on the way to Hudson Bay. And again and again and again, dear friends, life-changing relationships in Temagami with the members of the Temagami Anishinaabe, with dear friends like Gary Potts, who was the chief there, and my mentors at Trent, Harvey McHugh, Bruce Hodgins, John Wadland, and others who I, as an undergraduate, were my professors. So something clicked for me. So in some respects, I've been in various ways trying to investigate and tell this related story or stories since my mid-20s. And before that, my family, I grew up in the American South and deeply segregated South Florida. And one of the reasons that we returned to Canada, well, there are two reasons. My mother had 3 sons. She didn't want us to go to Vietnam, and she didn't think it was right for us to be living in a segregated society. And when I went to Kenora, I was about 22. Anyways, I didn't even finish something like that. And I just thought, shit, Lamar, this is Mississippi. This is South Florida. This is insane. I mean, one of the first nights I was there, I saw a bunch of, white guys and a bunch of people from Grassy Narrows get into a really nasty fight. And then, I mean, once again, I want to thank both Caroline Berduchny, who was my co-supervisor for my dissertation, but also a current student of hers, Erin Dolmage, who's finishing her PhD and teaching at Seneca. And they insisted, as I was talking about, okay, I'm going to turn this into a book. They said, well, you got to break the rule that the CBC told you never to break. You've got to put yourself in it because you've had these experiences. You've been to these places. We've seen the photographs, and you have to find a way to put that in. And Michael went through the photographs, the gentleman who designed the book, Michael Maynard, and he, some of them are archival, many of them are mine. And then he said, well, what about this moment? Were you there? And I go off and write that. And those became the interludes. So I was anxious about it. I'm no longer anxious about it. I was anxious about it the whole time, thinking this is going to be one of these horrible 21st century subjective things. It's all about me. And I hope I pulled off the right balance. Aaron told me I did. So, and I hope readers do, but it was very new for me to do it because I don't do that in my films. I never have, really.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think you did pull it off. I think it was good. I mean, and it reminds me of one of the things Lyle Dick, who was he was a Canada Parks historian for a long time, and it was CHA president for many years ago, and he said, you know, you can't write about a place until you go there. You have to go there and know it. And that is something that those interludes, I think, brought to the book. I have time for one more before we, because I want to bring it to the legacies and to commemoration, which is also part of, I assume, what the title, I was going to ask you about the title, Two Dead White Men, and what that means. But, you know, drawing together some of the themes from our conversation, right? You've talked about how they haunt you, and these men have different legacies that are shifting and changing, like even in the context of you working on this research, their legacies have changed. And there's a Wheeler quotation which comes out of The Poet and the Indian, where she calls them the best and the brightest of their times, right? And yet they have these policies, this chosen ignorance, as you call it at one point in the book. And, you know, I wonder if you want to talk about how this should inform how we're thinking about these issues today, particularly we as settlers who are making assessments about government policy, but also standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples as we try to work towards reconciliation in a good way.
I think one of the things has motivated me to stick with it, and Scott and Soustelle, is the necessity for intellectual humility and empathy, because I'm afraid to say that in 25 or 50 years, some of the things that you and I believe very fervently may turn out to have been absurd or worse. It's quite possible. In this case, with Canadian policies towards First Nations people, the policies were lethal, literally lethal. But I think we need to reflect on how is it that so many people blessed with a vote, an ability to be informed through quality journalism, stood by and watched that happen. What was the ignorance? What was the complicity? What was the willingness to let go or think other things were more important? And so what I try and do with Scott is get people to realize the gentleman was a Canadian, a powerful Canadian, a gifted Canadian, but he represented ideas that were very widely shared. Why is that? And what does it mean for us as a country? And with Soustelle, he was ahead of his time. He was ahead of his time in acknowledging the brilliant, or for a European, he was ahead of his time in acknowledging the brilliant and sophisticated civilizations of Mexico and what we consider to be Central America. He validated those civilizations, and, you know, the word in French is vulgarisation, you know, popularized it. He got thousands of young Europeans to go to the Musée de l'Homme and go, wow, the Aztecs, wow, the Mayans. It was a great project. I mean, that Soustelle and a different project than plundering. It was a different mindset, but put in the political bear trap of a conflict with an Indigenous majority in Algeria, he failed himself. And a lot of people are examining that moment strictly, you know, through the lens of French and North African politics now. But I thought it was important to consider the two dead white men, not dispense with them, not say, oh, Scott, those people were so messed up. We would never have done that. Actually, people like us enabled Scott to do exactly what he did. How did that happen? So I don't think we should be dispensing with these people. We should be engaging with them and thinking about them. And I would say that's true of both Soustelle and Scott.
Thanks. I think now we,
Wow, that's a great conclusion. Very great answer. Wow.
do you want me to moderate the question? Shall I moderate are there questions?
So, you said, I think you said this at that time, one couldn't be a Canadian and an Indigenous person. And the way you said at that time made it sound as if you could now, but at the same time, when you were talking about Harper apologizing, the phrasing that you used was Harper apologizing to the Indigenous people on behalf of all Canadians, which makes it sound again like they're discrete groups. So, you know, given that I think we are at a moment where we are trying to find ways in which we can make sense of the notion that one can be Canadian and Indigenous at the same time, I just wondered, given the sort of ways you're talking about, how do you think that that's going? I mean, do you think that we are succeeding or not? And I can see that my own language just there indicates that we're not, by the way.
I think it's a tough row to hoe, and I think there's a lot of contradiction. I think there's a lot of, frankly, virtue signaling. And I think that when it gets right down to, are we going to build that pipeline? Are we going to explore for more fossil fuels off the shore of Labrador? These critical questions where economic development, often in Indigenous lands or places where Indigenous lands are going to be affected. The prevailing development thrust of settler society is still prevailing, more often than not, I would say. And I think it's great that there, my grandchildren are learning important lessons about the Indigenous communities around Noguchiwanong, Peterborough. I think there is progress, but I don't feel equipped as a settler to say how well it's going, other than to say that a lot of the Indigenous people that I'm in touch with frequently in many parts of the country don't think it's going well at all.
Also, what your answer says to me, like Duncan, Campbell, Scott, we are people of our time, which is the note you ended on too, right? That what we are doing now is informed by our own milieu. So that's, yeah. Thank you.
I guess, do you think we've learned anything at all? I'm from the States, and I'm constantly trying to distinguish between sort of institutional and attitudinal racism. And I'm amazed to find there's so much attitudinal racism, right, that still exists. And it seems like there is this important distinction I've seen emerge in some of my fellow countrymen, right? There's look, if I were in 1930s Germany and I were 6 years old, I could very well become a Nazi, right? Because they would have told me what my values are, right? But now I find case after case after case that, I have friends in the States, and if you take them with the values they have now, right? If you put them in 1930 Germany as adults, they would have become Nazis, right? Do you think that, by focusing on these precedents, we're able to recognize when we're inside and outside those kinds of information bubbles, or we're always going to be trapped in them, right?
Well, I think that humans can do the right thing, and there is progress. I mean, I had the good fortune of being in South Africa at the moment or around the time that apartheid ended and Nelson Mandela got out of jail. South Africa is not a perfect place by any stretch of the imagination, but it is significant that apartheid ended. I think it's significant that First Nations people, should they want to, can now vote in a Canadian election. They couldn't until 1960. I mean, that's important. I think, as Thompson Highway and others have said, and as Thompson has practiced, the astounding number of high quality Indigenous writers and filmmakers and dancers and musicians is a blessing to our entire society and to the world. Something in Canada, I mean, some of those voices were there. I mean, Gil Cardinal of Alberta is one of the greatest filmmakers in the history of Canada. Well, he was making films in 1980, so it's not entirely new, and but there's a lot of tremendous work being done that people are fascinated with. So in that, in that cultural sense, I think that's good news. But in raw political terms, we'll have to see. And I detect, and certainly in the community where I live, and I don't know Alberta at all, but there is a backlash. I mean, and I don't know what form that backlash is going to take, but there are some Canadians who are a little tired of hearing about Indigenous rights already, and I don't know where that's going to go, or what political momentum that may pick up. I don't know, but it's there.
Do you think people ever get over this idea that when you talk about Indigenous rights, you're trying to make them feel guilty? I mean, this stupid misconception people have, right? That you're trying to, like in the States, right? You talk about civil rights, and I have friends who think I'm trying to make them feel guilty about slavery. I'm not. I mean, I'm just trying to make them recognize the fact that they were born in North America as white guys in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, they hit the fucking jackpot. Did that ever go away? I mean,
I can't say.
people take it so personally when they should
Now
just.
you're asking me to be a psychologist.
There are a couple of questions.
I've got an incident here that I recalled, a lot, that sort of illustrates my question. Maxwell Johnson, a guy named Maxwell Johnson, brought his 12-year-old granddaughter into the Bank of Montreal in Vancouver to register her bank account. She'd just gotten her ID from the Department of Indian Affairs. And so this was kind of a coming of age moment. There were not one, but two mistakes on one piece of ID. Now, what's the most important thing about your identification? It's got to be totally accurate, right? So this is an example of where the horrific stories, for instance, that we see about the residential schools, kind of washes away the fact that it was a really lousy education that they were putting out. Generation after generation of remarkably low literacy rates. And as you say, we've got so many writers now. Do you think there's any modern hope for the Department of Indian Affairs or Indigenous Affairs, or should it be like a starter?
I think it's a decision to be made by Indigenous communities and how they want the Assembly of First Nations to interact with the government. I couldn't say.
I latched onto your comment about the exclusionary framework of Canadian liberalism, and I was wondering, in the work that you did contrasting these two men in their eras, if you saw some subtle shifts between Scott's, the Canadian liberalism environment of Scott's era, and then Soustelle's era, and then the present day. If you see some evolution or shifts, or it's been basically the same kind of bedrock foundation with like cosmetic changes over the decades.
Well, Soustelle tried to enforce change in '55, and he couldn't. There had been a report after the Second World War, after France survived Nazi occupation and the Allies won. there was a very comprehensive reform program that was defeated by Pieds Noirs, Algerian European settler interests in North Africa. But that was the official policy of the government. They just couldn't find anyone to enact it. And then Soustelle came along in 55, and that government thought, well, now we have a governor general who has the credibility to move it forward, but it was too late. I think in Canada, John Diefenbaker made a huge change with the Bill of Rights. I mean, you know, one of the myths surrounding liberal rule in Canada is that they're always the progressive folks. It's not the case. What John Diefenbaker did in 1960 to allow Indigenous people to vote in elections was revolutionary. And he was a conservative. So, but he believed in human rights. He was a lawyer and he knew something about the international context, and he knew that Canada was failing then. Compared to some of our other prime ministers, he was also an early opponent of apartheid in South Africa. I think there are moments, and this may be one. I think that the current government, Justin Trudeau, elected 2015, re-elected now twice, 2019, 2021, correct? Made a lot of promises about reconciliation, and in some cases has failed to deliver. In other cases, perhaps there has been progress. I'd have to leave that up to people. I know, because there's a number of women in Indigenous studies at Trent who've been involved with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls tragedy for some years. They don't think that the current government has taken the report that came down in 2019 seriously. Now, COVID also came down in 2020. So I think there's a lot, you know, the woman there with the mask, the multicolored mask. I think there's just a lot right now that is hanging in the balance. And I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll have to ask ourselves as a society and as voters, are we serious? And are the people we're voting for serious about these issues? The province where I live, Doug Ford wants to build more highways right into the north and thinks that developing the chromium in the whole swath of the west coast of James Bay, which is Treaty 9 territory, is going to be you know, the next great Canadian super project. He's not really discussing that with the First Nations in that area. He's just going on the old, well, that's up to the federal government to do that. We'll deal with the mining companies. So that's an instance where I don't see any progress at all. Oh.
Thank you.
Don Smith, I knew Don would have a question.
Jamie, thank you very much for your comments. I sort of feel like I've lived in two worlds myself, because my interest in Indigenous topics goes back to the late 60s. And there I described the reaction of non-Indigenous people to Indigenous people as indifference and ignorance. And that predominated really until quite recently. So that I don't know how to respond to that. I'm not sort of you do all this active. You're an active guy. You're doing journalism, social work. You're just right in there in the picture. I'm in a bubble. I'm in a time bubble. But that's my perception, and indifference and ignorance. And I don't know from that. When I start from that point, I see progress. And I know that it's so easy to be critical, like the land acknowledgements. I mean, it's kind of. I like it because I think it's an expression of goodwill, and there's got to be follow-up, of course, but I like that, and that's sort of an indication to me that there's something happening here. And
But gosh, anybody who thinks they've got the answers, good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, like, look, you talked about the vote and you've got Chief to Chief. Wow, I love that. That goes back to my boyhood. But who gave the first the franchise, the first offering the franchise to Indigenous people was John A. Macdonald. But of course, with Macdonald, there's look, you have to have property, but that's his thing. It's just so freaking complex. So I just, anybody that comes out like you don't do, but anybody with the guns firing and stuff, I just back away.
Well, I thought that was you behind the mask, and I'm delighted you're here. Thank you for coming. And you know, when I certainly, as somebody who studied at Trent and starting in the late 1970s, I mean, your work is very important to all of us, and it still is. I mean, your most recent book, I think, is a very important book about studying individual famous Canadians and their relationship with Indigenous people. There's a lot of wonderful research in that book. So I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad that you feel there's progress. I mean, you'd be a good person to detect it. And, you know, I think that there are some lovely things happening. I just hope they continue happening and they become more part of our society.
But you hit the nail right on the head when you talk about Indigenous culture and the presence of literature, art. It's astounding. Look at the people up for prizes and stuff. Most of them are Indigenous.
And it's complex, and some of the stuff is complex too, which is great. I mean, I'm sure some of you have read Permanent Astonishment by Thompson Highway. He did not have an absolutely negative experience at residential school, quite the contrary. And he's very, very honest about it. And I think it's important that these different kinds of stories get out. And so I'm delighted that you feel that way. I hope I feel that way in 5 years, in 10 years. I'm glad you mentioned the land acknowledgements, because I thought the way that John did it to kick things off tonight was lovely. It wasn't just reading a script. He kind of spoke from his heart and mind in his own words. He got the facts right, I'm sure, but I think it's important to make it meaningful. When people think about it, you know, I was asked to be on the board of the Peterborough Historical Society, and they're really good historians and civic people on it, you know, but they've managed, you know, unfortunately, for decades to tell the story of Peterborough about Scots and Irish settlers, period. And that is a fascinating history, but they're challenging themselves, I think, in a good way. And, you know, with our advisory committee and with our other board members, you know, in our relationships with Curve Lake and Hiawatha and Alderville, the First Nations that are all around and part of Nogajiwanong in many, many ways, part of the city itself in many ways. When people do a land acknowledgement, they just speak for themselves. You know, I went out with my buddy and collected wild rice, Manoomin. You know, they say something about the indigeneity of the space that makes it meaningful to them and what they respect. And I think, and it's been great to see that. It's been beautiful, actually. So yeah, that's good.
Would you like to come back up, or how do we wrap things up?
Well, this honestly, how refreshing to be sitting with other people and having a conversation like this and hearing about ideas. And wow, what a wonderful evening. Thank you, James. Thank you, Nancy, and thank all of you for coming tonight. I hope to see you here again soon.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Nancy, you're doing a wonderful job.